The sound of the slap cut through the chamber music so cleanly that the cellist actually missed a note. My cheek was still ringing when Margot Easterbrook drew her hand back and hit me a second time. Harder, and somewhere behind me I heard a champagne flute hit the hardwood floor of her sunroom and shatter. Nobody moved to clean it up. 60-some guests in their good coats just stood there in that overheated Rosedale mansion, watching me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. That was the night I phoned my dad. That was the night I stopped being the version of myself who apologized for things that weren't her fault. My name is Mara Holloway. I'm 34, I'm a structural engineer, and I run my own consulting practice out of a converted warehouse space in Leslieville, the kind of place with exposed brick and a single space heater that never quite keeps up with a Toronto February. I've spent 11 years stamping drawings for condo towers and pedestrian bridges across southern Ontario, which means I've spent 11 years being the only woman in rooms full of men who assume the stamp belongs to someone else. I'm used to being underestimated. I did not expect to be slapped for it. To understand how a 61-year-old woman in a cream Aritzia blazer ended up putting her hand across my face twice in front of her own engagement guests, you have to go back about 5 months to a Tuesday morning in September when my biggest problem was a deflection calculation on a parking garage in Mississauga and a contractor who wouldn't stop texting me in all caps. I'd been with Julian Easterbrook for 2 years and 8 months. We met at an infrastructure conference in Ottawa, of all places, both of us trapped at the same bad hotel buffet, and he made a joke about the rubber chicken that actually landed. He was a corporate lawyer, 39, divorced, no kids, the kind of calm that I mistook for steadiness instead of what it actually was, which was avoidance dressed up nicely. We dated for a year before he introduced me to his father. We dated almost 2 years before I met his mother properly, beyond a handshake at a fundraiser. I should have clocked that gap. I didn't. My life that September was, genuinely, good. I don't say that as set up for tragedy, I say it because it's true, and I want you to understand what I had before I tell you what almost got taken from me. I'd spent my late 20s grinding at a big firm downtown, the kind of place where junior engineers do the work and senior partners take the credit at the ribbon cuttings. At 29, I went out on my own. I partnered with a man named Curtis Okonkwo-Rise, someone I'd trained alongside since we were both 23 and terrified of our licensing exams. We trusted each other completely. He brought in the clients, the charm, the golf course relationships. I stayed late making sure the load calculations were right, because if mine were wrong, buildings fell down. Holloway Reyes Engineering had 6 employees, a decent reputation across the GTA, and a project list that finally gave me the kind of financial footing I'd never had as a kid. I owned my place in the East End outright, more or less, with a mortgage rate I'd locked in before everything got insane. I had a cat named Rebar, an enormous orange tom I'd adopted from a shelter in Hamilton 3 years back, who hated everyone except me, and tolerated Julian the way you tolerate a coworker you don't actively dislike. I want you to picture the Tuesday morning I'm talking about. Rebar parked on the windowsill, doing his judgmental loaf. My laptop open on the counter to drawings for a footbridge in Burlington. Julian at the island in yesterday's undershirt, scrolling his phone, the light coming in gold and slow the way it does in early fall before everything turns gray for 6 months. He looked up and said, "Mum wants to do dinner Sunday." "Which Sunday?" I said. "This one." I remember putting my coffee down very carefully. I'd met Margot Easterbrook exactly twice before that, both times brief and polished, both times ending with her asking, within minutes, some variation of what my firm billed annually. She had a way of smiling that never once touched her eyes, and I'd driven home both times, turning the conversation over like a stone with something underneath it. "Is this a thing?" I asked. "Or a regular thing?" Julian did the half-smile he did when he was being slightly evasive without technically lying. "She wants to get to know you better. We've been together almost 3 years. She thinks it's time." I said fine. I said of course. I told myself every woman alive has a complicated future mother-in-law, and that I had survived worse than a woman with opinions about napkin folding. What Julian had not told me, what I would not find out until dessert, was that he was planning to propose that night. He got down on one knee in his parents' dining room in Forest Hill, in front of Margot and his father, Desmond, who was a soft-spoken man with the specific energy of someone who'd learned 30 years ago to let his wife run the room. Julian said the things you say. I said yes and meant every syllable of it. I was 34. I'd been careful with this relationship in a way I hadn't been careful with anything since architecture school. I loved him. Margot hugged me and said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart," in a voice warm enough that I actually believed her. It was a performance. I just didn't know that yet. The shift was small at first. A comment at Thanksgiving, which we apparently were now spending with his family, about how she'd always pictured Julian's wedding at a particular vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake that her book club friend's daughter had used. Not aggressive, just a pebble dropped in still water, watching the rings spread out. I said Julian and I hadn't really talked venues yet. She said of course, and moved on smoothly. Then there was the thing at Christmas, where she mentioned to Julian's cousin, in passing, that I did engineering work, in a tone that made it sound like I checked tire pressure for a living. The cousin gave me the specific kind of suburban pity I have zero patience for, the kind that says, "Oh, you have a job. How brave." Julian changed the subject without correcting her. I brought it up in the car. He said she didn't really understand what structural engineers do. She didn't mean anything by it. I said she asked me our firm's annual revenue the first time we met. Julian. She understands exactly what she's asking. He went quiet. I used to read that quiet as thoughtfulness. By January, I was starting to read it differently. By the time the new year hit, that gray, bone-deep Toronto January that makes you question every life choice that ever got you a winter coat, Margot had suggested twice that maybe I was too focused on the firm to give her son the family life he deserved. Mentioned once, smiling, that his ex-wife had been so devoted to creating a home. Asked me at a dinner where I was the only person who'd actually finished the beet salad, whether my father was still working or retired. I said he was semi-retired, which was technically true. What I didn't add, because it wasn't her business and because I refused to lead with it, was the rest. My father, Desmond Holloway, had spent 30 years building a civil contracting company out of a single rented backhoe and a loan from a credit union in Sudbury. He'd turned it into an operation that now handled infrastructure contracts across 3 provinces. He drove a 14-year-old Ford pickup. He still called his site foremen by their first names and remembered their kids' hockey schedules. He was the best man I knew, and Margot didn't know a single thing about him, because I'd made the deliberate choice not to tell her. It felt like a test I wasn't going to take on her terms. The engagement party was her idea, naturally. The 3rd Saturday in February, a date she picked herself, at a private club in Rosedale her family had belonged to for 2 decades. She chose the caterer. She chose the florist. When I gently suggested Julian and I might want a say in the guest list, she looked at me with such serene confidence that I felt like a kid asking to rearrange furniture in someone else's house. I should have known, standing in that slush-gray parking lot in my black dress, watching my heels sink into half-frozen snow while Julian held the umbrella over me, that I was walking into something I wasn't ready for. The first hour was fine. Champagne, introductions, the particular exhaustion of being assessed by people pretending not to assess you. I talked about the firm. I talked about the house Julian and I were planning to put an offer on in the Beaches, a house I had already, somewhat ridiculously, sketched preliminary floor concepts for in my notebook, because that's what engineers do. We can't help ourselves. I talked to Desmond, who was kind in a muted, careful way, and to Julian's sister, Phoebe, who seemed almost apologetic about the whole evening, in a way I couldn't fully read yet. Then Margot pulled me aside, one hand on my elbow with a grip that was surprisingly firm, steering me toward the coat check, away from the main room. She smelled like Chanel No. 5, and I remember thinking that tracked. "I want to talk to you about something before this goes any further," she said. "Of course," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. "I've been looking into your firm," she said. A pause. "Into you." My stomach dropped a good 3 inches, not because I had anything to hide, but because of how she said it, slow and deliberate, like she'd found something and was savoring the unveiling. "Curtis called me," she said. The floor tilted slightly. Curtis, the man I'd built Holloway Reyes with over 7 years, the man who had a key to the office and access to every account and knew every client relationship we had. Curtis had called Julian's mother. He told me some very interesting things about the state of your firm's finances. Margot said, "Pleasant as a scalpel is precise." And about some decisions you've been making without his knowledge. He's quite concerned. "I'm sorry, Curtis called you?" "He's worried about his investment," she said. "And frankly, so am I. My son is about to merge his entire life with yours. I have a right to know what I'm looking at." I felt the cold clarity that shows up when anger is in the process of turning into something more useful. "Whatever Curtis told you," I said, "I'd like to hear it directly, because I'm not aware of any irregularities in our firm's finances." She looked at me a long moment. Then, still smiling, "He said you've been diverting client retainers, that there are accounts he can't access, that you've been building something on the side without telling him." The accusation landed like something sickle, because it was a lie, a deliberate, constructed lie, and because I understood instantly exactly why Curtis would have told it. I didn't get to respond. Julian walked over with 2 glasses of champagne and a look on his face that told me, in the specific ways you can read someone you've loved for 3 years, that he'd heard at least the tail end of what his mother had just said. Margot looked at her son, then back at me, and said, loud enough that the 2 couples nearest us went silent, "I will not let some penniless little fraud drag my son down into whatever mess she's made of her own business." Then she slapped me. The room went quiet in waves, rippling outward from the point of contact. I stood there with my hand halfway raised to my cheek, not quite touching it, my brain doing the thing it does in shock, searching for a logical explanation for something with no logical explanation. She hit me again, harder. Julian said, "Mum," in a voice that was too small and far too late. I lowered my hand. I looked at Margot Easterbrook's face, flushed with absolute conviction, and I made the clearest decision I'd made in months. I walked to the coat check, got my coat, walked out the front door, into the freezing rain, stood on the salted steps of that Rosedale club, and called my father. He picked up on the second ring. He always picks up on the second ring. "Dad," I said, "I need you to come get me, and I need you to deal with this without any mercy." A pause, maybe 2 seconds. Then, "Where exactly are you?" "The club on Crescent Road, front entrance." 40 minutes, he said. "Go in somewhere warm. Don't talk to anyone." He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask me to explain. That's Desmond Holloway in a single exchange. He assesses what's needed, tells you what he's going to do, and then does it. I'd watched him operate that way my whole life. I had never been more grateful for it than standing on those icy steps with my face still burning. I went back inside, not to the main room, but to a small, empty sitting area near the coat check. And I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Chandrasekhar, who's handled the firm's business affairs since we incorporated and who has the specific gift of answering her phone on a Saturday night without sounding remotely annoyed about it. I told her everything in about 4 minutes. She said, "Mara, listen to me. Get into the accounting portal right now. Screenshot every account balance, every transaction from the last 90 days, every retainer in and out. Do it before he does anything else." "You think he'd actually move money?" I said. "I think a man who called your future mother-in-law with a fabricated story about your finances has already decided to do something," she said. "I don't know what yet. Document everything. Tonight, before Monday." I spent the next half hour in that chair doing exactly that. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The shock had burned off and left something cleaner underneath. Not calm exactly, but focused. The kind of focus you get once you understand you're in a fight and feelings are no longer useful. Here's what I found in 35 minutes, and it confirmed what I already suspected. Curtis was the one moving money, not me. 3 client retainer accounts required dual authorization for withdrawal, and on 2 of them, the log showed he'd added a secondary user 3 weeks earlier. A name I didn't recognize. He'd been quietly building the infrastructure to drain those accounts and pin it on me. The story he fed Margot wasn't a lie he'd invented out of spite. It was a cover story for what he was already doing. I sent Priya the screenshots, all 43 of them. She texted back 3 minutes later, "You're going to be fine. Don't say a word to anyone at that party tonight. Your father's coming? Yes. Good." I heard the shift in the main room before I saw it. The string quartet stopping, voices dropping into that particular register a room gets when something is happening that everyone's watching, and nobody wants to admit they're watching. My father had arrived in 38 minutes. I don't know how he drove that fast from the 401, but Desmond Holloway has always had his own relationship with urgency. He was standing just inside the entrance in his work clothes, dark canvas jacket, the kind of boots that have seen actual job sites, 63 years old, lean, weathered, completely out of place in a room full of cocktail attire. He had 2 men with him. One was his lawyer, a compact, precise man named Theodore Nkamelu, who'd represented Dad's company for almost 20 years. The other was a banking contact named Walter Pham, who'd clearly driven over on a Saturday night in a sport coat thrown on over a hockey jersey. Margot was already moving toward him before he'd crossed the room. "I'm sorry, this is a private event," she said in her most controlled hostess voice. My father looked at her without expression. "You're Margot Easterbrook." Something in his tone made her stop moving. "I'm Desmond Holloway, Mara's father." A pause. "I think you and I have some things to discuss." I walked in then. I watched Julian see me, see my father, see Theodore and Walter, watched something shift behind his eyes I couldn't fully read yet. Phoebe was standing near the fireplace, looking almost relieved, which I filed away for later. Julian came toward me, said quietly, "Mara, I'm so sorry. What she said, what she did, I should have." "Not now," I said, without cruelty. "I just didn't have the bandwidth." My father, Theodore, and Margot had moved toward the windows. Desmond Easterbrook had materialized beside his wife the way he always did, quiet, present, half a step behind. I went and stood next to my dad. Margot looked at the 3 of us and visibly recalculated. "I don't know what Mara's told you," she said, "but I was simply protecting my son's interests." Theodore said, "Mrs. Easterbrook, I'm going to stop you there." He opened a leather folder and laid 4 pages on the nearest table with the unhurried precision of a man who'd done this many times. "These are preliminary findings from a forensic review of Holloway Reyes Engineering's accounts, initiated 40 minutes ago at my colleague's request." He tapped the pages. They document a pattern of unauthorized access and fund movement traceable to the firm's co-founder, Curtis Okonkwo Rise, not to Mara Holloway. The room had gone very still. Not silent. People were still talking somewhere behind us, but the 20 or so guests nearest had stopped pretending not to listen. "That's not," Margot started. "Curtis called you with a fabricated story," my father said, conversational, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised his voice. "He is, right now, in the process of stealing from your son's fiancé's business. He gave you a script to use as cover, and you used it." He looked at her with the steady attention of a man who'd spent 30 years negotiating with difficult people and had run clean out of patience for theater. "You slapped my daughter twice in front of 60 guests." Margot opened her mouth, closed it. Walter said from just behind my father, Desmond. "I can confirm the account review. We flagged anomalous access on 2 of the joint accounts Thursday. We were going to call Miss Holloway Monday, but," he glanced at me, "given the circumstances." I looked directly at Margot. "I want you to hear this clearly. You called me a penniless fraud in front of everyone in this room. You put your hands on me. Twice." I kept my voice level. I've been practicing that particular control since I was 22, and I wasn't about to lose it now. "My firm billed $2.1 million last year. I own my place outright. I have no consumer debt. My credit score is 814. I paused. "And my father built a contracting company across 3 provinces out of 1 backhoe and a loan from a credit union. You asked if he was retired. He isn't. He just doesn't feel the need to announce it over hors d'oeuvres." Something crossed Margot's face, not remorse. I don't think Margot Easterbrook has ever felt remorse in the conventional sense. It was closer to recalibration, the realization that she'd attacked someone without confirming the terrain first, which, in her world, is the one unforgivable error. Desmond put a hand on his wife's arm. "Margot, just that," Theodore said quietly. "Ms. Holloway will not be pursuing assault charges at this time, provided this evening concludes without further incident, and that you make no further contact with her firm, or her staff." He said it like a fact, not a threat. "If that condition isn't met, we'll have a different conversation." Julian, behind me, said, "Mum, you need to apologize." Margot looked at her son, then at me. The certainty in her face hadn't fully collapsed. People like her don't fully collapse, they reorganize. But it had cracked in the one place she'd believed untouchable. "Mara, I acted on information that I now understand may have been, I said. "Okay." I turned to Julian. His face was doing something complicated, guilt and grief, and the beginning of a reckoning with who his mother actually was. I'd loved that face for almost 3 years. I knew every register of it. "I need you to tell me something," I said. "Not her. You. Did you believe any of it?" He didn't answer right away. That pause told me everything about what the next 6 months would look like if I stayed. "Okay," I said. I kissed his cheek and meant it. Then I picked up my coat from the chair where I'd left it and walked out with my father, Theodore, and Walter into rain that had turned to freezing rain, and I didn't look back. The drive home was quiet for the first 10 minutes. My father drove the way he always drives, both hands on the wheel, unhurried, the rain steady on the windshield. Finally, he said, "You doing all right?" "I will be Curtis," he said. "Yeah." Theodore's filing the injunction Monday morning, freezing the joint accounts. "You'll have full documentation within a week. Criminal or civil?" I thought about 7 years of building something with someone I trusted, about the key he had to the office, about the calculated, patient way he'd decided to burn it down and hand Margot the match. "Both," I said. My father nodded once. That was that. It took 4 months and it was not pleasant, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Curtis had moved faster than we'd caught. He'd already wired $71,000 into a numbered company registered to his girlfriend. Priya's forensic accountant traced it in 11 days. We filed civil and criminal complaints. He settled the civil case 7 weeks later for full restitution plus damages, just over $110,000 by the time interest and legal fees landed. The criminal matter resolved with a plea: probation, community service, a permanent bar from holding fiduciary roles at any engineering firm in Ontario. Holloway Races became Holloway Structural Group in April. I bought out his equity as part of the settlement. I promoted our project manager, a sharp, unflappable woman named Alia Whitcomb, who'd been with us 4 years, and was, frankly, better at half of Curtis's job than he'd ever been, to associate principal. We hired 2 junior engineers that spring. The firm is intact. Better, actually. Cleaner. Julian and I ended the engagement 2 weeks after the party. It wasn't dramatic. We sat in his apartment and talked for 3 hours, and what came out of it was honest and sad and necessary. He loved his mother in the way people love someone who's always made their world smaller and safer at the same time. And he wasn't ready to stop doing that yet. Maybe he'd get there someday. I hoped so, genuinely. But I was 34. And I'd worked too hard and built too much to wait around for a man to decide whether his mother's version of me, or the real one, was the one he actually believed. I kept the ring 2 days, then gave it back, because it was a beautiful ring and I didn't want to look at it anymore. Margot never apologized. Not really, not in the way that reaches anything. She sent a note through Theodore, 3 careful lawyerly lines expressing regret for any distress caused. I read it once, filed it, and haven't thought about it much since. Phoebe called me in March. "I want you to know I told him she was wrong," she said. I told him before he even proposed, actually. I told him she'd do something like this. A pause. "I'm sorry he didn't listen." "Thank you for saying that," I said. It mattered more than I expected it to. My father, for his part, never once said "I told you so," because that isn't who he is. What he did was show up at my place the weekend after with a bag of Rabar's favorite treats and a tourtière his housekeeper had made, and he sat at my kitchen counter drinking coffee while I talked, listening the way he always listens, completely, without an agenda, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing. At some point I said, "I really thought I had it figured out this time." He said, "You did figure it out, just faster than you expected to."